back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. I'm happy for you to join me today. Usually I'm sitting here with Odie Martinez next to me. He's producing full on today, so he's to my immediate left, and he's doing all of the technical end of our production as well as fielding comments and questions. So it's just me here with you today, and I'm glad for you to come join me. Thank you. I want to wish everybody happy holidays. Yesterday was Christmas Day, and a week from yesterday is New Year's Day, and so there's a lot of holidays going on right now for all of you, and I'm all the more appreciative for you to join me. Maybe it's timely in a podcast that's dedicated to recovery from addiction, and we do so much focusing on managing stress, including interpersonal stress. The holidays sometimes can bring that, so it's hopefully timely for you to be with me today. Thank you. Thank you again for coming. Just as a quick review, for those of you that are new today, our perspective for this podcast, Ask an Addiction Specialist, is really looking at addiction primarily from a psychological perspective. That's my background. I'm currently a professor of clinical psychology at California Southern University here in Orange County, as well as I work as a recovery coach here in Orange County, including leading a good number of psychoeducational groups each week. I'm just coming from one today, as is typical on Wednesday afternoons here in Southern California, and I'm very much informed by that work, and will bring that work to you as well. And the focus, as I introduced that group this afternoon, was that all of the group members in most of the treatment centers that I consult with here in Orange County are, the group members are actively involved in some form of self-help support groups, oftentimes 12-step oriented, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and so on. And so they're familiar with looking at addiction from the perspective of it being a spiritual disease, a spiritual malady that requires a spiritual solution, spiritual healing. And I don't feel like that what we talk about today or any day is at cross purposes with that particular diagnosis or perspective. In fact, there's so much kind of cross-fertilization, it feels like to me, between psychology, at least in terms of how I understand psychology, and spiritual resources. Having said that, we'll be focusing on the psychological dimensions primarily today. It's ironic that I say this because last week's presentation, which I encourage you to check out, it's available on YouTube and here on Facebook, as well as at Beginnings Treatment Centers, who, by the way, are our sponsor for today. Our conversation last week was about anger and resentment. And for any of you that have familiarity firsthand with the 12-step groups, which I do as well, resentment is oftentimes seen as a major barrier to sustaining sobriety. So we talked about anger and resentment last week, which is picked up from a spiritual perspective in AA or NA, and we looked at it last week to include a psychological perspective, and we'll be doing the same thing today. Our topic today is self-compassion, and I think that you can look at self-compassion very much in a very rich, informative way from a spiritual perspective, and as well as a psychological perspective, and so we'll be bringing that interface in today. With a focus on the psychological perspective. So that is our topic today, building self-compassion and recovery. Let me mention a couple things as we get started. I want to invite your interacting with me. Odie is here armed and prepared to forward your questions or comments to me, and I would love to interact with you in real time as we're moving through the material for today. So please feel invited. You can write him in the chat box for the Facebook group is a good way to reach him. You can also reach him through the YouTube chat function. So please feel free to submit your questions, and I'll do my best to incorporate your questions into our presentation today. A very quick review, and then we'll dive into the material for today. We've discussed a lot over the last year of podcasts various psychological factors that feed into addiction, including emotions and stress. And we've talked a lot about shame, and we've established that shame is, first of all, it's the most stressful human emotion. If we look at just sheer release of cortisol in terms of stress hormones, Shame is associated with the highest elevation of the stress hormone cortisol. And how we've defined shame, I think all of us have an association to shame. We'll think of words like humiliation, embarrassment, sometimes guilt. We've talked about shame very specifically, the way that psychology looks at shame, and really looking at it as two sides of the same coin. One is anytime I feel threatened in terms of social acceptance. We'll get to the self-acceptance in a moment. Anytime I feel threatened in terms of social acceptance, that is, I'm going to get kicked out of a group that matters to me, shame will get stirred up, and that will manifest as a stressful response, and we've all experienced some version of that. The flip side of that is some threat to what I said a minute ago, self-acceptance, or let's say a threat to self-esteem. And the two are inseparable. To be at risk of being rejected by one's family or friends, by those that we value the most, is certainly going to stir up anxiety by itself, but it also undercuts our self-esteem. In other words, if I'm not able to get people to love me that matter to me, how can I feel good about myself? And then my not feeling good about myself, that is, attacks to my self-worth, my self-esteem, that itself can feed into being further marginalized or rejected by people, only because people oftentimes will tend to be dismissive, ignoring or judgmental of those that are down in the dumps over their self-esteem. So it's an unfortunate vicious cycle. So how we understand shame then are these twin threats, and we've established that that's the most stressful human emotion. How is this relevant then to our conversations across all of our podcasts where we focus on addiction recovery? Well, it's directly relevant insofar as stress is the number one trigger. Psychologically speaking, stress is the number one trigger for relapse to addiction. So for anybody, especially in early recovery, it pays huge dividends to find any way we can to grab a hold of a deep understanding of stress in our lives and what we can do strategically to reduce that. And so we're looking at reducing stress more generally and more specifically are reducing personal shame. Which brings us to today's topic, which is building self-compassion in recovery. And how, pray tell, does that have to do with shame? Well, let me tell you. Okay. Shame is the opposite of self-compassion. Shame opposes self-compassion. And so if we want to look at building in compassion for ourselves, shame will strike right at the root of that, and it will effectively squelch our capacity to be kind to ourselves. Now, how does that work? Let's talk a little bit about how it is that shame opposes self-compassion. Think of a time that you've been ashamed yourself. See if you can take a moment just to register a time where you felt shame in terms of either a threat to being rejected by somebody that you cared about, and or feeling really like crawling in a hole because you just feel so awful about yourself. Maybe because of something you've done, maybe some quality that you have that has left you doubting yourself, questioning yourself, judging yourself. Take a moment. In the context of talking about addiction and recovery, I would be remiss if I didn't bring in that virtually every client I work with, almost all by definition, are either in early recovery and or loved ones of those in early recovery, is that shame is right at the center of this, because virtually every individual who has experienced being caught in addiction, they suffer not only rejection by those that care for them, oftentimes for good reason, to be honest with you, but also self-rejection in terms of self-judgment. And so if you think about shame in your life, whether it's in regards to addiction or anything else, one of the things that's characteristic of shame is that we become focused on ourselves. Technically in psychology, we call this self-referencing. And so when I'm ashamed, I get caught up in myself. To put self-referencing into English, it's just basically I, me, mine. I get more and more focused on myself. In fact, if you think about shame, at least for me when I think about it, I'm acutely self-conscious when I'm stuck in shame and I can't seem to get out of it. In fact, I assume that you're seeing in me what it is that I don't like about myself. And so even my perception of you is assuming that you're thinking the worst of me, because I certainly am thinking of that of myself. I want to welcome our viewers and our listeners. Somebody just chimed in. Good afternoon to you, Pam. Nice to have you with us. So if shame is by definition an I, me, mine kind of pothole that I get stuck in, let's talk about that just for a moment in terms of two brain systems. One brain network is simply referred to by neuroscientists as the default mode network. And we've spoken of this in some detail in recent weeks, and I won't be able to go into great detail about this. It's just enough to say that self-referencing, that I, me, mine, that is so characteristic of shame, is directly plays into the default mode network. And all that means is our brains naturally default towards self-referencing. And I was thinking about this earlier today. If our brains naturally default towards looking around to make sure that we're protected and safe, then when shame comes in, it's like that self-referencing on steroids. That self-referencing times 100 or maybe times 1,000. And so if our brains naturally default towards vigilance, scanning the environment, in shame that is peaked out to the top. It actually goes right out the top, and we're stuck in the depths of the default mode network. Well, I said there were two brain networks. Well, the second brain network that's important for us to acknowledge here is what's referred to as the executive mode network. So if there's the default mode network, there's the executive mode network. If I talk about this just in terms of brain anatomy for a second and physiology, right between my ears is the primary location. It's home base for my default mode network. So it's linked to the emotional center of the brain, particularly the fight, flight, or freeze response that's located in between my ears. The executive mode network is more focused, its home base is more my frontal cortex. My frontal cortex is looking at long-term planning, rationality, communication, compassion, moral behavior. It's really the navigator, generally speaking. If you think of an executive, it's the CEO. But what happens when the default mode network is activated, particularly when shame is at the root of it, is that default mode network will effectively trump the executive mode network, and my capacity to self-regulate, that is kind of calm myself, as well as relate to others in an open, interactive way, is basically thrown offline. So if that's the diagnosis, is that if shame basically is linked to my default mode network and it throws me in a ditch and that I can't get out of, and if I can't access my lifeline, which is to my executive mode network, then what's to be done? What's the prescription here? Well, in the context of today's conversation, I'd like to suggest one prescription. I don't think there's a single one, but I think one very effective prescription here, or antidote, let's say, is self-compassion. Self-compassion, by definition, is a function of the frontal cortex, is a function of the executive mode network. So we'll talk more into this as we go today, but to whatever extent I can exercise the muscles of self-compassion so that I have access to that, especially when I'm in the ditch of shame, especially when I'm in the ditch of the default mode network, then that's a good thing. That's a good thing. That does give me a lifeline. So self-compassion linked to the executive mode network, shame linked directly to the default mode network, and then strategically speaking, how do we deliver ourselves from the default mode network, especially when we're sunk by shame? Let's apply this for just a second, and I'm going to ask you to join me, and you're welcome to jot down some notes as we talk about this. Just a brief little exercise here. I want you to think see if you can identify in your memory sometime perhaps recently, where somebody gave you a compliment that you weren't able to receive. In other words, it couldn't go in. I had one client years ago who talked about it this way. When somebody gave him a compliment, he felt like he had a Teflon shield, and the compliment could not penetrate that Teflon shield. So see if you can identify at any point in your life, recently or in the distant past, a time where somebody was able, paid you a compliment and you were not able to really take it in. I don't have Odie with me today, so I get to be Odie and Bob today. Okay, I'm going to do my best Odie impersonation. No, it would not be good because I don't do impersonations well. I'll just be myself. There are so many instances that come up for me. One very painful experience, and I believe I've shared it here on this podcast before, was this is almost 40 years ago. In graduate school, where I got attention in class for having done a really good job on a test, and it went into just mortification. There's no other word for it. I wanted to crawl into a hole as attention was drawn towards me. And it hasn't always been that way up to that point for me, but I'll tell you what is true for me. And that was a marker event for me, which is why I've mentioned it here before, is that whatever compliments came my way from outside being oftentimes in school for me, sometimes in athletics or music, other things that I was involved in, I would politely nod my head, but I'm not sure that it really penetrated. I'm not sure that I was any different than the individual who had the Teflon. And it wasn't like I made a decision to be Teflon. It just, that's what I did. And so I don't think it ever went in. That day when attention was drawn to me publicly with a whole classroom of other students, it went into really, it was painful for me. And I think part of the pain was recognizing that I'm not really receiving these compliments in the spirit in which they're given, and maybe never have. And so I had a long history, I think, of winning awards or other kinds of acclaim, and it really didn't go in. And I think it was complicated by the fact that I was embarrassed by that. And so I would actually do the socially appropriate thing, thank you for sharing that type of thing. And I didn't want people to know that it was as if I was tone deaf to sincere compliments or affirmations. Now, how I understand that in hindsight, and if you have some version of that, either near or distant in your own past, how I understand that in the context of today's conversation is that with shame in the default mode network, in the driver's seat, there's no way in for what we're talking about. Even the most sincere compliment does not go in. I'm going to talk about this for a few minutes now. One of my ways of understanding that is that, well, you can almost kind of come into this backwards. You can use my example if you want to. I was not able to allow that compliment that day in my class. Wasn't able to allow that in, and so you can only imagine. It's not a big leap to imagine what it's like inside for me. Is that not only was I not able to receive that from outside, but I wasn't able to receive that from inside. And you can think of that, how that goes for yourself. Because to the extent that I wasn't able to receive that from inside is to the extent to which I was experiencing shame. And specifically for me would be impaired self-esteem. And so even if I was being kind of included in the group, so to speak, by my accomplishments, that's an interesting twist. It just came to me. Is that having attention drawn to me was always a mixed bag, because sometimes that would actually set me apart from a group. I think I've shared this example here before, but if you haven't been here, I'll share it again. I can remember in 8th grade the experience of having my girlfriend in 8th grade, Winnie, find out that I was a good student in class. And immediately after class, said to me, "I didn't know you were smart." And I remember thinking right then, I don't think that being smart in any visible way is a great way to keep my girlfriend, and for that matter, maybe to keep friends. And so I made a decision early on to keep all of that kind of hidden away. But it led to my never really inhabiting my accomplishments, whatever it is that we've accomplished in our lives. Psychology calls the root of self-esteem simply self-efficacy. Whatever it is that we're competent at, can we not allow that to come in? Can we not allow ourselves to be that? And I really, at that point, made a fairly conscious decision not to allow that in. It made me a geek or a nerd in a way that I wasn't wanting to be a geek or a nerd. I wasn't going to get the cute girl in my case by being smart. And so I think we make these decisions along the way. And I think long before that came along, I felt like in my family of origin, I learned very strong lessons about not standing out because it didn't go so well for me. So each one of us has our own biography, our own kind of entry point into this business of shame. But I didn't have great self-esteem, and I couldn't allow things in that could have built that because they would set me apart from others, including winning attention for, in this case, being smart. So I hope that makes some sense. Does that make some sense, Odie?
That makes perfect sense.
Thank you, Odie. Odie says that makes perfect sense. Thank you very much. And I'm taking that in, Odie. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I don't want to make this unnecessarily complex, but what I want to respect is the fact that each one of us has our own multiple entry points into shame. And the bottom line is that shame will keep nourishing oxygen outside. We don't really receive that. So in an oxygen depleted environment, to use that as our metaphor for right now, I can't really thrive. My way of understanding this is that the poor get poorer. I was already suffering from worries about not fitting in to my peer groups going into adolescence and on into graduate school those years later. But I also was really struggling with a sense of who I was. And part of who I was somebody who was good at a few things, and I couldn't take credit for that. It really did not go in for me. Let's talk about how the poor get poorer for just a second. This is new material that I've been reflecting on in the last few weeks, and I'm going to talk about this in a way that I hope communicates. And if you have questions or comments, I encourage you to chime in. I feel like there's a double tragedy here, and how I understand the double tragedy is that for so many of us that have suffered with addiction in our lives, there's almost 100% correlation from childhood trauma with those that have struggled with addiction. The technical term for this in the trauma literature in psychology are the studies that looked at adverse childhood experiences. They call them the ACE studies, ACE, adverse childhood experiences. And so whether you experience various forms of abuse or various forms of deprivation and abandonment, it doesn't matter. They add up to leaving that individual, that child growing into youth, adolescence, and then into adulthood, way more vulnerable to addiction. And so I see there's a comment. I'll get to that in just a second. Let me finish this thought. And so there's the trauma at the root of our addictions. I would say the trauma that's at the root of much of our anxiety and depression and other suffering in adulthood. And it's not as if that's enough alone. There's a double tragedy because then there's shame about the trauma. There's shame about what the trauma leads us to do. If you've struggled with anxiety, if you've struggled with depression, if you've struggled with relationships, if you've struggled with being able to remain attentive, if you've struggled with various forms of addictions, whether it be to substance or to behaviors, then there's all of the shame and self-judgment that comes, and there's plenty of judgment that comes from without. And there's something about that whole thing that feels like a rotten shame, if I can use that phrase in a colloquial way. There's a rotten shame in terms of the double tragedy. It's not enough that I or you experienced developmental trauma. Then on top of that, we experience rejection by others and rejection by ourselves, which gets us right into the heart of shame. So I'll pick up on this just a minute. There's a comment or question here on the screen. Thanks to Odie. This person says, yes, I'm similar about not receiving compliments. I really think that this is much more widespread than just that singular experience I was sharing and what you're sharing. I appreciate you sharing this. What I'd like to do is normalize it to suggest that I've run into this a lot. Now, most of my contact with it has been clinical because I've done clinical work for 40 years. But this has also been the case not only with family, but with friends and loved ones, is that it's not so atypical. So we're talking about something that is itself kind of a default response, I think, to shame. This person goes on to say, I wonder how others let compliments in. It's a very good question. I'll come back to that in a second. Oh, wait, I'll come back to it right now because the next question is, do they just spend time savoring them? I was teasing with Odie a moment ago, but I'll tell you how this goes for me, is that I have really worked over the years, and I'm not sure which came first, the chicken or the egg. Because as I began to take in compliments, I realized I really did want to savor them. And as I began to savor compliments in the way that you're talking about it here, I began to experience the joy. Imagine, last night I was eating asparagus, and I ate it very slowly. I ate it very mindfully. I wanted to enjoy each bite of the asparagus. So I cut it, and each bite, I really noticed it. I did an experiment this morning where I was sipping a cup of hot tea, and I decided I really wanted to experience the hot tea. Hang with me, because this is meant as an analogy to taking in compliments. And I spent 3 or 4 minutes with one sip of tea, which is an awfully long time, and I realized it was an experiment. I can't do this all the time or I would dehydrate. But I looked at the tea. I've never looked at tea as much as I did today. I got close to the tea and felt its warmth. I smelled the tea. It's Chinese tea, fresh leaves, and it smelled, I never have smelled this tea that closely. And then I put it up close to my lips, and then I took in a mouthful. I was going to say I swallowed it, but I didn't. I actually took in a mouthful of the tea and let it just sit in my mouth and kind of radiate through my taste buds. And eventually I decided to swallow, but before I swallowed, I just noticed what it's like to move towards swallowing. I'm quite sure I've never done any of this in my life. And then I swallowed it, and I tried to imagine if I could track the tea going down into my stomach. Do not try this at home. I'm not recommending this. I'm teasing. I think we all should try something like this at home. But just as with the tea or last night's asparagus, what would it be like to slow down and to do that intentionally? Now, the reward today was that that's the most enjoyable taste of tea I've ever had, hands down. In fact, I'll tell you the truth, I won't ever forget that drink of tea because it's so exceptional to whatever I've ever done before. Well, take that as an analog to what we're talking about right now in terms of receiving compliments. What would it be like to slow down and savor, just like Bob's asparagus or Bob's cup of tea? What would it be like to really take in a compliment? I'll tell you also how this goes. When I lead groups, people will give me compliments. They'll say, thank you, Dr. Bob. We got a lot out of your group today, or something like this. And if you were there in group with me, you'd see how I operate with this. It's a bit like drinking tea. I'll almost always stop and I say, thank you. I want to appreciate that. And I'll say, could you please say what it was you appreciated about today? And I guess from one perspective, you could say Bob is really, angling for compliments, or I don't know, trying to dredge up something. I just want to know what it is so I can enjoy it. And actually, it's twofold. So I can enjoy it and so I can do more of it, whatever it is I did. And so almost always people will respond with specifics. And when they share specifics, I'll let that go in. And I'll see if that resonates for me. I don't take 4 minutes taking in a compliment like the tea, but I'll take a few seconds. And I have come over time to really enjoy that. And I do have to say this, I think this is true, is that each time I take in a specific compliment, let's say in the context of a group, it lays down a strand of self-knowledge. It feels good to me, but it's like now I know. Now I know something about myself that's almost impossible to get to unless I get feedback from the environment. The psychiatrist Carl Jung said it's next to impossible to be who we are without mirrors in our environment that see us. And that's how I come to know myself, the contours of who I am. And that's new for me. I used to move through it quickly. Aw shucks, kick the dirt, move on, or politely say thank you very much and basically not remember what you said. I used to be this way. I can still be this way. I'll ask somebody, I'll move into a new situation where I meet a bunch of people and I'll say, hi, what's your name? And you'll say Odie. And I'll register it. And I'll say, hi, Odie. And then I'll move on and I will promptly forget it if I don't rehearse it. So I'll oftentimes now, people must think that I'm painfully slow. I probably am slow. No, I think I'm fast too in other ways. I'll say, tell me your name, Odie, and then I'll say, and I'll pause for a second. And I'll go, I'm happy to meet you, Odie. And then we'll move on and I'll forget your name and I'll ask again, could you tell me your name one more time? And when you say Odie the second time, now we're getting to where it's starting to register. It takes a while for it to register. Well, imagine that around compliments. It's like, could you say that with a little bit more detail? I know it sounds odd probably socially, but I'm more interested in being able to absorb what's good oxygen's coming in. I'm more interested in absorbing that than I am looking normal socially. So anyway, something like that. Oh, is there, the final question here, is there a risk of getting overly egotistical? It's an interesting thing around being egotistical. And I think there are people that are basically kind of fishing for compliments. And that's not what I'm talking about here. And I think people can sense when I ask them that it's not about that. It's like I think most people, in fact, they'll say they really appreciate it. If they give me a compliment, they can say I pause. It means a lot to offer. Think about what it's like to offer somebody a compliment and you realize it didn't go in. I don't know for you all, but for me, it doesn't feel very good. It's like it kind of gets brushed away. Well, that's what I've done to compliments a good bit of my life. I'd like not to do that to other people because I don't like how it feels. And so when I pause to receive a compliment from somebody else, I think they're appreciative. And what I said there's a funny thing about egotism is that there's what Carl Jung called positive inflation. That is, I'm blowing myself up bigger than I am. But I think for many of us, and I really feel this strongly for those of us in recovery, and 100% of my work right now is with individuals who are in recovery and their loved ones, is I think the problem is not so much about positive inflation, that can come up. I think it's much more often around what Jung called negative inflation. And his idea of negative inflation, it would be to not see who you are. He says, is that any less inflated to undersell yourself? Many of you have read that quote that's attributed to Nelson Mandela and or Marianne Williamson, and I don't have it at my disposal right now, but the essence of it is, who am I to undersell who I am? Why don't I take in fully what you're bringing to me? And the crazy thing about narcissism, which is associated with people being puffed up and so on, is that years ago I read a book by Thomas Moore, the psychologist who wrote this incredible book, The Care of the Soul. Many of you are probably familiar with that, and if you're not, I recommend you checking it out, as well as especially his chapter on narcissism. I went to a presentation by Thomas Moore. It was in a home up in Malibu, and sat right there in front of him, and I asked him a question about that chapter on narcissism, and I've never forgotten his answer. That's almost 30 years ago. He said the problem with Narcissus, the myth of Narcissus, is Narcissus looks into the pond and falls in love with his image, which is a reflection from the pond. And Thomas More's response to my question is the problem with Narcissus is that he doesn't go deep enough. He needs to go through the reflection, through the surface, down into the depths of who he is to resolve the narcissism. And without that deep connection to his own giftedness, her own giftedness, we stay at the surface, and that really is a manifestation of what psychology calls narcissism or grandiosity. You'll get people that are very interested and puffed up in showing off the outer surface, and the sad tragedy of that is that they're not being seen, including themselves, from a deeper place inside that would actually feed the deeper hunger. So that's a lot in response to your question. I hope that that's a decent start anyway. And my sense of what we're talking about itself might be the healing balm for a lot of what passes for egotism. I've certainly been egotistical, and I think sometimes my own egotism has been a function of my not really taking things in. So you kind of oscillate between negative inflation, which is I don't deserve anything, so I'm Teflon, to positive inflation, which is I'll brag about things in a grandiose way, but in neither case am I really rooted in my actual truth. There's another comment that's come up. Let me read this here. Oh, this is good. This is good. I'm going to come back to this comment, I think, in a few slides because this is really valuable. This is a practical suggestion about self-compassion. We've been talking about receiving compassion, empathy, support from others, and we'll be moving into talking about self-compassion. I'd like to come back to this, and hopefully, Odie, there's a way to save it. I don't want to lose that. Okay, thank you, because I do want to come back to that. Let me do this. Let me get back on track for just a moment with where we were talking about. You remember we were talking about how the poor get poorer. When you have that Teflon response to compliments, it's kind of a vicious cycle, and it starts oftentimes by developmental traumas in our lives, which themselves are highly associated with shame. Most of us can't bear that feeling of shame, and we find ways to self-medicate that, hence addiction to substance, addiction to behavior, and some combination of all of those. But let me spend just a minute more talking about how does it go when I've been traumatized? How is it that can so easily arc over into shame? My way of understanding, one way to understand this comes from my background in studies in social psychology. I did a research study many years ago in graduate school, and it was looking at the dimension of belief in a just world. The idea here is that to the extent that I believe in a just world, I believe that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people, and never the twain shall meet. So in that spirit, and we all vary on a continuum from a high belief in a just world to zero belief in a just world. And to the extent that I believe that good things happen only to good people and bad things happen only to bad people, then you can see where this applies around trauma. So if I've experienced trauma, there must be something wrong with me, something defective with me. And by the way, what I'm describing is almost a universal experience of any child growing up. Most children don't have the luxury cognitively nor survival-wise to challenge their parents, for example, if they're growing up in a depleted environment, much less an abusive environment. So that child will internalize there's something wrong or broken about me. And for many of us, from childhood into adulthood, it never really changes. So we end up operating with a blueprint in adulthood whose foundations are based on childhood experiences of deprivation and loss on the one hand, trauma and abuse on the other, and we end up with a blueprint or a template for ourselves that's really based primarily in shame. I've sometimes wondered about this around psychological trauma, and I'll use trauma right now as the umbrella term for all kinds of things that can run aground developmentally in our lives. What is it that trauma traumatizes? And this is a place where I feel like the line between psychology and spirituality dissolves. I don't really think there is a line between psychology and spirituality. I think they're vastly overlapping domains and cross-inform each other. I've only ever felt that way. So when I answer this question, what does trauma traumatize? I actually answer it with a spiritual response, which is it traumatizes what in the East they call our original face before we were born. In Western traditions, such as in Judaism and Christianity, we talk about the image of God. It traumatizes God's spirit inside of ourselves. To put it in a non-religious format, it traumatizes what it is that your fate is or your destiny is, why it is that you were born, why it is that we're here. And so if we roll this forward then in terms of trauma traumatizes that, which is the pearl of great price for each one of us, our original face before we were born. What's doubly or triply tragic about all of this is that we start off, first of all, with the experience of deep pain, emotional pain, physical pain, life pain. And then the response internally to that is self-blame for the very thing that causes us the pain and which only compounds the pain. So we start off in suffering, and then the suffering digs deeper and deeper grooves in our psyche by virtue of self-blame or shame. We're going to move just in a moment to what this individual just shared with us. Let me set up this because I think it's great what this person shared. I want to ask you all, can you imagine, we've been talking about not being able to take in other people's compliments, and really what's at the root of that is that it's dissonant. It doesn't feel congruent with who I am, so how can I really take that in? At least that was the case for me. Can you imagine, in light of whatever disappointments, whatever derailments you've experienced in your own life, across your life, from childhood on, can you imagine self-compassion rather than self-blame? Can you even allow yourself to imagine into that? And now what I want to do is I want to bring in what this individual shared. I think the most accessible tool, in quotes, I have found for connecting with self-compassion, that's really what we're talking about, imagining connecting with self-compassion rather than self-blame/shame. I think the most accessible tool I have found for connecting with self-compassion, especially when I'm in the grips of shame, I guess this is brilliant, is to imagine a dear friend who is facing the same issue I am and ask myself, how would I respond to her? I want to tear up. My eyes begin to tear up when I read this because it's so touching to me. Imagine a dear friend who is facing the same issue I am and ask myself, how would I respond to her? ... Always a shift to instant compassion. I need to remember that. That's really beautiful. It evokes for me someone that I bring up from time to time here is early in my college years, read a biography of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And she is such an example, such an embodiment of this kind of compassion we're talking about, is that just as you say, imagining a dear friend who is facing the same issue and being able to then move into instant compassion. Mother Teresa talked about looking into the eyes of each individual, young or old, that she worked with in the streets of Calcutta, many of whom were afflicted by the deadly disease of leprosy. And so were really in great physical and emotional suffering. And she would talk about looking into their eyes and seeing something beautiful for God. That was the title of the biography I read. She said that she saw the eyes of Christ in the eyes of every person she looked at. And I believe that. I've had clients that have talked about looking at themselves at a younger age and now as an older brother or sister or uncle or aunt or parent, how would they want to reach out to support that younger child? I've worked with individuals who literally have children, and I would ask them, how do they respond to this when they see it in their child suffering? Whatever the language of compassion is, I think this is a beautiful, beautiful pathway. You called it a tool. I think it's a beautiful tool to have. I know what I've done in my own life is I'll oftentimes picture myself at age 5 or 6, and I have a mental picture of myself at that age. I also have a sense of what I was going through at that age and kind of the beginning glimmers of consciousness at that age. Ages 6, 7, and 8 were the kind of the emergence for me of beginning to be conscious of the gravity of my situation and the beginnings of trying to forge choices that would be more oxygen bringing for me. And I'll oftentimes imagine that little boy, that little Bobby. It helps a lot to have some kind of access, whatever it is that access to our hearts, which would reach out in reflexive compassion. I like how you put it, instant compassion. So we've talked about a couple of things today. First of all, in terms of the bad news, is that shame opposes self-compassion. Shame undercuts all that we're talking about. And I think we've established that, and I hope that you can think of examples of that. The exercise that we had earlier in terms of imagining receiving a compliment. Receiving a compliment means that I've got enough self-esteem where I can actually receive it without dissonance. It actually is congruent with how I feel about myself. And to the extent I can't receive that is to the extent in which I'm limited in terms of self-love, self-compassion, self-affirmation. So that's the bad news. And the good news is right next to it, and that's really where we've landed here, especially with this last intervention. The good news is that self-compassion is stronger than shame. Self-compassion wins the day. I like how it is in the New Testament. I had to pause and remember the verse. Odie will remember this. It's one of my favorite verses in the New Testament. Perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love casts out fear. I think that it does. I think perfect love casts out shame. I have this image of love as being a light, like a bright light. And shame likes to lurk in the shadows and would like to draw us into the shadows and would take us down into the shadows. And exposing to the light, exposing shame to the light of self-compassion, the light of other compassion, the light of love is very effective. I've often had this sense in my mind that where there are clouds, even when there are clouds in the sky, the sun is still there behind them. And it just takes the sun kind of burning its way through the clouds for the clouds to evaporate and disappear. And then you have bright sun. I think it's that way with love and compassion. There's also further good news, and that is this, is that to paraphrase the name of one of my favorite books, we can retrain our minds around what we're talking about. You know, we talked earlier about my pausing to take in a compliment from Odie or a compliment from somebody in one of my groups. We can retrain ourselves. We can retrain those old reflexes, and I'm committed to that. It's been almost 40 years. It was spring of 1980 when I had that experience, that wake-up call where I was not able to take in a compliment in class. And so I've had a few years to work at this, and I've had some good years and some bad years. I've had lots of opportunity to practice, not the least of owing to addiction and just devastation following on addiction. But I've had lots of practice at this, but I really do believe that we can build our minds, our souls, however you want to understand that. And as we retrain our minds, we actually change our brains. To put it in this language, we can create new neural pathways so that the path of least resistance is no longer shame. It actually can become self-compassion. If you think of it like building a set of new muscles, we're talking about building the muscles of self-compassion. So this individual said, I like your use of path in place of tool, path to self-compassion. Thank you. The words matter so much, don't they? I liked your word tool, but I preferred the word path, or I wouldn't have used that. And I guess it's individual. It's like path for me. It conveys a journey. I don't know. When I think of tools, I'm a guy. I was raised with toolboxes. You know, you take tools and you pound on stuff, you saw stuff, and I went out to my toolbox just yesterday and I pulled out my power drill. You drill stuff, you know. And I think some of this stuff needs some serious sawing and pounding and drilling. But I think also that it's worth the image of a path for me is a gentle path, being gentle with ourselves, even as we make forward movement. So whatever image works, I'm glad that path communicates. That was it right there. You just saw what we were talking about. I read your comment. You say you like my use of path in place of tool. And I received that. Thank you. I think that words really matter, and nuance, finesse really matters. And I think it's very individual. I think one person's path might be another person's tool. I paraphrased a favorite poet today in the group. I said, what is honey to one is poison to another. And I think it really takes tuning into ourselves to know what works for us. And really, if you think about it, tuning into ourselves is itself an act of self-compassion, right? There's an image here. I bring up the image. Maybe you've brought it up, Odie. I love this image of developing these muscles of self-compassion. And with that image in mind, I want you to know that we've introduced today the topic of self-compassion. And I'd like to use that image as kind of a metaphor. How do we build them? It's build our heart muscles, to put it that way. And I'm being figurative in saying that, and I guess I'm being literal at this point. Neuroscientists talk about the heart brain, and we're talking about building that heart brain. My supervisor years ago, Bonnie Badenoch, talks about building brain while nurturing the heart. So the next several weeks we'll be talking about how it is that we can restore faith and hope in ourselves, how we can restore self-compassion in our lives. Over the next several weeks, I'll be introducing specific exercises that continue to kind of morph and transform in my own practice, and I hope them to be useful to you. Practices in self-forgiveness and self-compassion. I want to suggest practices that you can modify and tailor to your own needs, but really what we're talking about is as a practice that builds these muscles, and to put it in the negative, it's to build shame resistance. It's to build pathways that are deeper and stronger. I said perfect love casts out fear. I think that we can build pathways to perfect love. And so we'll be talking about various prayers and meditations towards that end. I really do believe there is hope in all that we've talked about today. Even as we begin to move from shame towards self-compassion, I think there's tremendous hope for all of us in that. And I feel like it's right at the heart of deep level transformation. And at this, when I think about recovery, I think what we're talking about is recovering our deepest selves. And so recovery is a catchphrase for work in addiction, that's for sure. But the deeper truth about recovery, whether I've been in addiction or loved someone in addiction or have been spared somehow or another, both of those, it's about recovering our deepest, truest selves. And self-compassion is right at the heart, literally, of that. Thank you. Let me mention, as we wind down for today, next week, I announced this last week, next week's presentation, very much in the spirit of what we're doing today. I don't know exactly where it will go, other than it will be an interesting presentation. We'll be talking about creating a recovery lifestyle. And really what I'm suggesting today with this practice is developing a full-blown recovery lifestyle that is all about recovering who we really are. And we'll have an expert coming in next week, and he's coming in from Switzerland. He'll be actually joining us from Switzerland. He is a well-known holistic dentist in Switzerland, Dr. Thomas Rüdi. And he'll be joining us talking about recovery from a holistic or integral perspective. I know Thomas through Integral Recovery, which is a movement within recovery that is very interested in holistic recovery. And by that, I mean body, mind, and spirit. And there are all kinds of resources online that you can find out more about this if you're interested. I'd recommend that you go to Integral Recovery Institute online, and you can find out more about what it is that brings Tomas to us next week, as well as so much of what informs. You know, when we talk about the fact that psychology and spirituality cross-inform each other, that's a holistic perspective for sure, and it's one that I embrace deeply. And technically that's referred to, at least in some of the literature now, as integral recovery. If you go to Integral Recovery Institute, you'll find out resources. There are now 3 books out on integral recovery. The first book is by my dear friend John Dupuy, and you can look up Integral Recovery online and find that book on Amazon or otherwise. 2 other books by another dear friend, Guy Duplessis. You can look up Integral Recovery books, and you'll find those 3 books listed. And sometime in the next period of time, I hope to have a 4th book added to that. I'm working on a book that's integrating the material that we're talking about and continuing to marinate and move forward ever so gradually. So next week, come join us. There's one thing I want you to note is that next Wednesday, we typically meet at 3 p.m. on Wednesday afternoons Pacific time. We'll be meeting several hours earlier out of consideration to Tomas, who'll be calling in from Central Europe. So our meeting next week, our podcast next week, will be at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And Tomas will be joining us about 7 o'clock his time in Switzerland. Really encourage you to join us. Really would appreciate you joining. He'll be bringing in a perspective of a holistic perspective and applying, he knows a tremendous amount, extremely knowledgeable across multiple domains, all of which pertain to a really holistic approach to recovery from addiction. I think there's one final question here. Comment. This person says, I'm learning that compassion isn't just a good feeling. Compassion is an action with an intention. Yes. Sometimes I don't feel compassion, but I'm willing to sit with difficulties without using addictively. And that is self-compassion too. You know, one of the founders of, one of the significant contributors to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous, and anybody who's been in the program, the 12-step program will know this, is the first American psychologist, William James. I've been mentioning Carl Jung today, the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. Carl Jung and William James were 2 of the primary kind of founding spiritual fathers of AA, and both were, Carl Jung was involved in early correspondence with the founders of AA. You can read about that in the Big Book and other places. And William James was referenced in the early days by Bill W. and the other founders of AA. He is the first American psychologist and very influential in psychology. And one of the things that William James talked about that reminds me of what you're talking about here, Angela, thank you, Angela, is that there are times where I can act in the program. I don't like this isn't the greatest saying in the program, but fake it till you make it gets at what is referred to as the James Lange theory of emotion. And the James is William James, the idea that there are times where I don't feel self-compassion, but let me just sit with and act out of self-compassion until I do feel it. The simplest way to think about this, and there's tons of research to support this, and it's cheesy as all get out, but it's true, is that if we're feeling depressed, you literally, if you smile oftentimes, that will bring about a change in affect or mood just because of what smiling does. It's a behavior that's linked to tons of muscles that are linked to happy emotions. So there's plenty of times that doesn't work, so please don't misunderstand me. But the idea here is there are times that I need to act with compassion, in line with what Angela wrote here, act with that even when I don't feel it so that it might come. It really fits with what I was saying earlier, which is that there are months and years in which I began to stop and try to take in compliments from outside so I could give them and receive them to myself inside. And I think I spent a lot of time practicing that with not great results. It takes a long time for Teflon to melt away, and I'm not done, not nearly done. So it's going to work. It's a work. We're all works in progress here, and I think that there's plenty of times where if you don't feel something, we can still host. We can host the spirit of self-compassion, and pray that the Spirit might visit us in our hearts. So thank you for that comment. Thank you for joining us, Angela, for your comments today. Thank all of you for joining us. I hope that you're able to come back next week with Tomas. It'd be wonderful to have you back here. If you have any final comments or questions, be sure to write me at bobweathers.com, and I would love to receive those comments and respond to you. Or you can write through Facebook, and Odie or Austin will forward those to me. Thank you for joining me, and may I wish all of you a Happy New Year, and may this be a Happy New Year that includes even more self-compassion than ever before. Thank you. Take care.